I'm Laura Beskow, and I'm here to tell you a little more about the work we've been doing on the consent process for Adaptable. As you've heard in other presentations as well as so far here today, Adaptable is really a unique study and kind of a real opportunity to be a national model for this sort of new research paradigm in terms of learning healthcare systems, pragmatic clinical trials, and so on. And so we think of the consent part in the same way as a real opportunity to try out new approaches and to try to be a model for how consent might be web-based, but participant-oriented and also effective in terms of helping people make good decisions about whether they want to take part or not. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the basic challenge we face is the same one we always have with consent forms, which is decades now of study after study documenting problems with consent forms being too long, that they are so long and seem to keep getting longer sometimes, so that patients don't even necessarily read the whole thing. Another related problem is the complexity that consent documents written at too high of a reading level, so that we would expect most people in the general population might not even be able to really understand what they're being asked to sign up for. So this is what we're up against, with these problems with length and complexity then leading to serious questions about comprehension and whether, in fact, in some cases, consent forms are actually becoming intimidating, and maybe even inhibiting rather than helping people understand, that people maybe are not even reading the whole thing, let alone comprehending what they're signing up for. So I'm sure you are, many of you are aware that new regulations have been proposed by the federal government in terms of human subjects protections. And if those are eventually made into regulation, then a lot of those are oriented around addressing this problem, that there would be regulations to make sure that consent forms are no longer these sort of unduly long documents where important information is kind of hidden in there somewhere. Instead, they would have to be very patient-oriented toward the things that a reasonable person would want to know, and formatted in a way that really highlights the key information. So that has kind of been our orientation on the Adaptable team. Thankfully, we bring a lot of resources to this one. I very much want to acknowledge my wonderful team who are sitting here today, who have been wonderful on this project. And also, we've done a fair amount of research now at Duke, specifically on simplifying informed consent and ways to improve comprehension. So we brought that to the process, but we still have this challenge of determining what would a person with heart disease want to know about the Adaptable study before they sign up. Our research, as well as some other studies, have shown, and I think Skylar maybe alluded to this too, that the way that participants think about these things and what they might identify as important may well be very different than what we as experts would identify. So the way we've approached this is, first of all, of course, we knew that we needed to meet regulatory requirements, so we drafted a form that we made sure met regulatory requirements. But beyond that, we were very focused on readability and length, keeping it simple, concise documents. So this is to show that the very first draft that we wrote was 4 pages long. It was written at a 7th grade level. Over the intervening months, there's been a lot of input about information that maybe should be in there. We've been kind of the gatekeepers on that. But always when we add information, it's now 4.5 pages long, but still at a 7th grade level. So really trying to keep it simple for people to understand. The other part that we've then done in terms of the consent form is conduct a series of what are called cognitive interviews. For these, we enrolled patients with heart disease. Some of them were the adapters. We also had other patients with heart disease. We had them read the consent form, and then we went back to the top of the form, and for each main section of the form, we asked people to tell us in their own words what they understood it to be saying, asked if there was anything confusing, anything they especially liked or found concerning, and whether there was any extra information or details that they thought we could take out. Given the general tight time constraints of Adaptable in general, we weren't able to do a lot of interviews, but with 10 interviews, I think we actually had pretty good diversity in terms of people that we spoke with. And to give you a high-level summary of the results here, I think that we had a very high degree of both objective and subjective understanding. When we asked people to tell us in their own words what the form was saying, what they told us was in fact correct. They were getting it, and they reported not much confusion really at all, even about concepts like randomization. They really seemed to get it. They commented on appreciating the lack of legalese and the effort that we were making to include patient input on this. There was not much of anything they identified as extraneous that we could take out. There were some questions about those initial drafts in terms of some items that are listed here on the slide, and so then we set about making changes specifically to address those questions and concerns that people had. So this is sort of a paraphrase of a quote that one of the interviewees said during the conduct of these interviews that I think actually is a pretty good summary of the whole enchilada here. That this person saying that they thought this was a good job of describing the study using plain language. They felt it was organized well, easy to read, and music to our ears, saying this covers everything that they would think of as a patient. But then they went on to say that they'd participated in studies before and really had oftentimes found consent forms to be too technical, too hard to understand, and saying that when people don't understand, oftentimes they just go forward without asking questions. Or some people think that some of those details don't apply to them or find them actually overly scary. So I think that's actually a great summary of the whole thing that we're trying to address here. Now, the other part of this web-based process, again, as Skylar alluded to, this isn't going to be an in-person interaction between people, but a self-directed process for people when they go to the website. And so we wanted to make sure that we have a way to help people make sure they understand what they're signing up for. So coming up with some sort of a comprehension assessment is very much in keeping with FDA guidance from just this past year about electronic consent processes, where they recommend asking people some questions to assess their comprehension. We developed what has become a 6-item multiple choice quiz, and the bottom line of how we approach this is the concept of the difference between ideal and essential understanding. That ideally we might like everyone to understand everything in the consent form, but in reality it's only a subset, and in fact a pretty small subset of the stuff in a consent form that is so crucial that if the person doesn't understand it, that we would actually question the validity of their consent. And so that was our approach to coming up with these quiz questions, and then using technical guidance about how do you come up with good multiple choice answers and things like that. So again, we conducted cognitive interviews specifically on the quiz. We had people read the consent form, take the quiz. While they're taking the quiz, speak aloud about how they're evaluating the answer options and how they arrived at their final answer. Again, we had interviewed 14 people, many of the adapters as well as others, with a pretty good range of demographic characteristics. And in general, I would say people liked the quiz. They found it helpful. They didn't find it too onerous. They felt like it covered the right information and so on. So the way that this will be implemented online is there's a video for the consent process, then they'll see the written consent material, and then there's this quiz, but it will be framed as, we want to make sure that we have done a good job explaining this to you. So then there'll be the 6 questions, and we're really using this as a chance to reinforce key concepts. So when people answer each question, then they'll be told specifically if they answered correctly or incorrectly, but also be given an additional bit of information to explain why the correct answer was correct and why the incorrect answers were incorrect. So this is an example up here of one of the quiz questions, asking about how you're going to be assigned your aspirin dose that your doctor's going to choose, you'll choose, or the computer will choose. So let's say I answered correctly, the computer was going to choose, then this web-based process would come up and say correct, and then explain neither you nor your doctor is going to choose the dose of aspirin, rather the computer will assign it, and it's important that you take the dose that you were assigned. So again, a chance to reinforce sort of key information.